Hello and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder that Just and Sinner as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor to all the things that we do if you want to see us continue and support the work that we do here. You can go to justandsinner.org, go to our donate page there, and there are a number of ways that you can give. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts that you give will be and are tax deductible. Okay, so I want to talk on the program today about Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, A Manual for Christian Dissidents. Now, this book is one that I have wanted to talk about for a little while. I think it was probably close to a year ago that I had asked for a bunch of podcast recommendations from listeners, things that you had wanted to see, and I've got this giant running list of topics that people have requested. And at that time, I had a number of people tell me that they wanted me to talk about this book and give my thoughts on this book. Now, I wanted to do something on the Benedict Option first before this because that was Dreher's other book. Now I've done a program on the Benedict Option, so if you haven't watched that, you may want to watch it first. If not, that's probably fine. But I decided I wanted to delve into that first because I thought it was kind of pretty foundational for the kind of material that we see in this text, so I thought it was worth delving into that first. But now that we've done that, I've wanted to look into this, talk about this book for a little while. In some ways, I kind of wish I did this right after I read it because it was a while ago, and I had to kind of go back through the book and try to remember everything that was in here that I wanted to talk about. But also recently, Dreher he was interviewed by Jordan Peterson. They had a discussion on this book, and I watched through that, and I thought there were some interesting comments on there as well. And I was like, people are talking about this book right now because of that, so maybe I should just do it now, and it's kind of on my mind since I had watched that. Now, I want to say a few things before we delve into the topic of this book. Preliminary things related to Christians and politics and theology and politics and the church and politics and all of those kind of things. Now, as a Lutheran theologian, the Lutheran Church has always intentionally distinguish between the role of the church and the ministry of the pastors and the purpose of Christian doctrine from the role and function of the state. I think we've done that very well. That doesn't mean that there is no place for communication between the two spheres, between the church and the state. It does not mean that the state is to be some kind of purely secular entity that is somehow divorced of any kind of religious identity. That's an idea of the Enlightenment. It's not something that's the case in really any classical culture or classical thought, and certainly not at the time of the Reformation. But specifically now, I'm going to be jumping into more of an American political context, though the American political context does have implications for a large part of the world. So this is not just isolated to the American context. So if you're not in the United States or if you're not in Canada, these things are still probably relevant in one way or another. Especially because it seems like whatever happens in the U.S. does affect the rest of the world in significant ways. But as Lutherans settled in the United States, this largely, and there are some Lutherans who settled very early, but the large Lutheran immigrations happen in the 19th century. And that means that Lutherans show up in the midst of a lot of political divisions that are already there within the United States, say divisions between the North and the South, think 19th century. And Lutherans had to make decisions about how they were going to respond to a lot of those ideas. Now, I'm going to be doing a whole series on the history of Lutheranism in America that I've started planning. And in that series, I'll delve into some of the specific discussions and debates and questions. But it's always been very intentional among a majority of Lutherans that they kind of stay out of political battles. Now, you could find, and this is true, especially in the United States, because they're immigrants. They're immigrants from Germany, from Scandinavia, and they're looking to just settle their own communities and kind of do their own thing. Kind of leave us alone, let us have our churches and our education, and we do our own thing. They become Americans, of course, and assimilated into the American context. But the Lutheran Church had always been quite intentional not to blend theology and politics or to confuse those things. And the reason I bring all of this up is because we are facing a difficult challenge today as a church. We're facing a challenge today as a church where everything in culture is seen as political. So that it really is inescapable that the church deals with politics. Now, it's the role of the pastor to proclaim law and gospel. And that means to proclaim God's judgment against sin, what's right and wrong, what God commands, what he says is good, what he says is evil, and to proclaim the forgiveness of sins. That's the primary role of the pastor in a Lutheran context, is law and gospel. We proclaim God's judgment against sins, and then we proclaim the forgiveness of sins. But included within that proclamation, then, are certain determinations that some things are right and some things are wrong. Certain determinations that evil actually exists, and it exists within each of us, not just in one particular group that we don't like, that we consider to be oppressive. So at the point that we are at today, it seems that we have to be political. There's just no escaping it. I think this especially as, today I just saw another video as I'm recording this of Elizabeth Warren talking about how pregnancy care centers should be shut down, not just in Massachusetts, which is what she'd said before, but now she says throughout the country. They all should just be shut down and stopped. And so we are coming to a point where there are significantly influential politicians who are desiring to shut down Christian ministries. And that's the kind of state we're in. So we're at the point where I don't think we can ignore politics. We do have to address politics, because some now of the basic moral claims that Christians are making have now all of a sudden become political topics. Are they inherently political? No. But the radical left has now made them political. So what do? Just avoid talking about them? No. We proclaim the truth, regardless of what someone else is going to do to us if we proclaim the truth. And I just want to say a word of caution here now as we're delving into some of these questions. The Lutheran tradition has never been theonomic, like the Reformed sometimes has. By theonomic, I mean a movement within the Reformed, like Christian Reconstructionism and various other Reformed groups who believe that the civic laws of the Mosaic covenant in the Old Testament are essentially part of the moral law and therefore are everlasting. So that the church, it's part of our role today to tell the state to incorporate all of God's laws as outlined in the Mosaic covenant. And yes, they'll talk about as they're adapted, in a modern context. So they don't necessarily support stoning, though you'll find some people that do. And there is this very much blending of church and state, and that the church has a right to speak to every political issue in various ways. Lutherans have never taken that position, and we absolutely should not take that position. We cannot, as a church, bind people's consciences to things that are not clearly in Scripture and are outside of our realm of domain. The state and the church are both essential. They're both essential for proper human flourishing and functioning in the world. But they serve different purposes, and we cannot conflate or confuse those two things. So, what that means is there are plenty of issues that Christians can, in good conscience, have different views on. And I can think of questions like economic policy. You could talk about the nature of the healthcare system and how that should work. What should the government involvement be in the healthcare system? We could talk about, welfare, for example, and how the welfare state works. We could debate gun control laws and what those should be or whether there should be any. Those are issues that Scripture doesn't speak to very clearly. Now, that doesn't mean that Scripture is devoid of any principles or ideas that can be involved in those debates. And as Christians do think through those ideas, we certainly should be informed by our perspective on Scripture. But I would never advocate a pastor preaching on those issues. Those go far beyond the questions of law and gospel, as is the pastor's calling. So when I am talking about these issues, I want to make that clear, because I know some people jump into these questions and say, you're just being a culture warrior. You're just, promoting the Republican Party. You're doing all of this kind of stuff. And I just want to make that clear from the outset. That's where I'm coming from here. I don't want to delve into those issues. That's beyond my realm of authority. I've been called to the pastoral office, and now I do have this ministry and my call working for the seminary of the AALC. But that calling and those vows that I took were not about making political statements about the economy and things like that. That doesn't mean I won't share those. I don't have beliefs on those issues. It doesn't mean I won't share them in personal conversation or ever mention them, but that's not my calling as a theologian. That's outside of my realm of authority to speak, blatantly and clearly about those issues in certain ways. So I leave those to other people to discuss those questions. However, we are in a situation today where we have one party. I mean, let's be honest. We have one party that is very adamantly pro-abortion, to the point of now several people being outspoken about wanting to shut down Christian ministries that help support women who are seeking care, who need help because they're young, poor, destitute, and going to have a child. And there is one party that has been fighting against free speech in the church and for the church. So I know Christians who vote for the Democratic Party. I know Christians who voted for Joe Biden, and I know they had their reasons for doing so. But at this point, while I certainly don't want the church to come out and say you should vote for this person or that person. That's certainly not where the church should be. That's not my place. It's not the church's place to do it all. I think we're a bit naive to say that we shouldn't talk about these issues at all, or that we can just kind of pretend these things don't matter, because they do. They do very much so. So let's talk about now, with that background here. And I'm always anticipating the critiques that I'm going to get. So I always do this, and I know, because I know what they're going to be. This is, okay, so Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher, a manual for Christian dissidents. Now, essentially if you're not familiar with Dreher's book here, now we looked at his prior book, The Benedict Option, and The Benedict Option was basically talking about how the church should function and must learn how to function in a post-Christian society. The West is a post-Christian society. It is becoming increasingly secularized. I think that is very clear in many ways. I recognize it's different in different parts of the country, but I'm in New York, so do with that what you will. But we are at the point where we have a lot of difficulties around us, that we are becoming a minority voice. Our voice is being shut out in various ways. And so we have to stop thinking in terms of the maybe religious right movements of, the Jerry Falwell days. We're not in that position at this point. And what we have to do is prepare a people to be faithful. We have to establish institutions, Christian communities that can and will last into the future. And we have to think more about the preservation of the church than we do about changing the broader culture. We need to sustain the church. And well, really, God sustains the church, and he promises that he will. So it's not up to us to sustain the church, to be clear. So, but we need to be involved in the church, the kingdom of God that is on this earth through the church. As God's people, we need to make sure that we have adequate places for a Christian worldview, a Christian approach to the world to be taught, fostered, encouraged in our people, especially as we think about our children, churches, and communities. So the Benedict Option is a way to do that, taking a cue from St. Benedict, who started monasteries, to say, what are ways that we can establish intentional Christian communities to navigate the difficulties that we face in this world today? So now this kind of follows up on that in some ways. And Live Not by Lies is a text that speaks about a lot of the what led to communism and communist revolutions, Marxist revolutions in Eastern Europe. And Rod Dreher, as he describes that he's had conversations about people who lived through communist nation, lived in communist nations, and had been imprisoned for acts against the communist state. So specifically, we're talking about the Soviet Union here. And so it's one individual that had a conversation with Rod Dreher, who said that they saw the same signs of the kind of totalitarianism that they experienced within the Soviet Union in an American context. And in particular, this has to do with the shutting down of beliefs and the freedom of speech when it comes to questions of things like gender identity and sexuality, and holding to traditional Christian sexual ethics and approaches to gender. And, Dreher explains that in his first interaction like this, he thought it was a little bit extreme to say, we're really, okay, yeah, I mean, things are getting a little crazy in the West, but it's not totalitarianism. I mean, that seems a bit extreme. And as Dreher went around then and started asking other people who lived within the Soviet Union, he found that nearly everyone that he spoke with about this question of totalitarianism and the question of, are you seeing the same signs in our context in the United States as you saw within the Soviet Union? And he says that the unanimous answer was yes. So this is what got him to start exploring this question of totalitarianism and asking the question, can we speak in some sense of a totalitarianism that is rising in the West? Are we living in a context, not to say that we're living in a context that is exactly the same as, the Soviet Union by any means. And if you read some of the horrific kinds of things that Dreher outlines here in terms of prisoners against the state, I mean, it's horrific, the kind of things that Christians were forced to do, or other dissidents. It doesn't have to be just Christians. And of course, we're not at that point. We're certainly not at that point politically, that Christians are being thrown in prison in the United States for fighting against the state. But that's not to say that there aren't legal and monetary and social consequences of holding to a classical, traditional Christian sexual ethic. And there are in many ways. So Dreher makes a distinction then between this hard totalitarianism, which basically says that, the state has all of this power, and the state is the one persecuting and prosecuting. People are literally being, sent to the gulags. And what he describes as a soft totalitarianism. So a soft totalitarianism is not a system where the government has this kind of oppressive power and is imprisoning people in such a way, or outlawing any kind of statements against the communist state or something. But there is a social pressure, a pressure upon people from their communities, from corporations, from the media, and from law in various ways. We can talk about issues of those who are forced to, bake a cake for a gay wedding, who don't believe that that's morally within their moral and religious systems, but they're forced to do it anyway. There is a pressure such that there is a social isolation that occurs and is being pushed more and more upon people who hold to particular views that go against the narrative, whatever that is, and today it has to do particularly with sexual ethics. So in order to then explain a bit about what's going on here, I think it's helpful to look at the foundations of what Dreher is saying within the Soviet Union, and this is what's called the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, at this time, as Dreher, I think, rightly points out and fairly points out, there was really a lot of abuse in the political system. There was a lot of oppression of the poor. And when we are looking at revolutionary movements throughout history, we're talking about, think about political revolutionary movements. And we could talk about the Bolshevik Revolution, the French Revolution in other ways. We could look at revolutionary movements today, or we could even go back to, say, the time of Luther and what the peasants were trying to do in trying to have a peasants' revolt against the state and the oppressive taxes and abuses that were prevalent upon the poor and really causing all sorts of social ills upon them. That revolutionary movements do not arise for no reason at all. There are always real injustices that fuel people's desires for revolution. And Dreher talks about this as he, had a conversation with somebody and just asked the question, well, how did the Bolsheviks' message even, like, how is this plausible? Like, how is this influential upon people? It seems so patently absurd when you are just kind of reading back into history in our context today. What made this attractive to people? Was it just something, say, that was pushed top down and that was it? Well, that's not how this works. Yes, ideas do tend to start from the top. And it is true that culture does largely change in a top-down way. We talked about James Davidson Hunter's book on this subject on other podcasts in the past. But it is true that when you're talking about the elites, whether it's the intellectual elite or the political elite, they often are the ones that start a revolution or revolutionary ideas. And that's not usually the people at the top of the chain, because the people at the top of the chain like their power. They're in a good position. They don't want it. But it's people that are in enough of a position of power to have influence, but they are not the elite of the elites. It does take those people to start a revolution that's going to be successful, at least. But it does also have to come down to the average person and speak to the average person's sensibilities. You have to get people on your side in order to be successful, at least to some extent. And so the question is, well, why was the Bolshevik Revolution, why would this be attractive? And the reality is there were profound inequalities. Now, when you look at communism, in the rise of communist movements and Marxism more generally, Marxism speaks to the reality of oppression. And, as Marx writes himself, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto write about, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You have this kind of ruling class that is just using the lower classes for the sake of their labor and benefiting off of them. I think of the old black and white silent film Metropolis. If you've never seen that, I highly recommend it. It's a really powerful film, but where you have basically this metropolis where these people are just working like crazy all this time, and then as you kind of go up the layers in this society, you find these upper class elites just kind of living off of luxury that the people below them are producing. And there's of course truth to that. There's truth to the fact that people on the top will abuse power and do abuse their power. That is a reality that Scripture warns about repeatedly. I mean, when the Israelites say that they want kings, they demand a king, and God is pretty explicit to the Israelites to say, "You sure you want a king?" They're gonna exploit you. The kings are going to try to get a bunch of horses and a bunch of wives and exploit workers, and this is what people do when they are in positions of power because people are sinful. And Marxism says, well, it speaks to a real problem, which is a problem of any human society, but it comes at that problem from a secular perspective rather than a Christian one. So Marxism sees religion as the opium of the masses, as is often said, that kind of keeps the masses quiet and keeps them in line, and says, well, established political order is not anything you can't do anything about that. So the upper classes basically just create and use religion as a way to oppress people. And so within then the Marxist system, there is no real sense of sin. There is no real sense of especially individual sin or original sin. And there is a kind of utopian vision that Marxist societies have. And so it has its own eschatology. Now, every system of belief has its own eschatology. By eschatology, we mean last things. What is the goal? What is the goal that you are looking for? People are oriented toward finding purpose, and that doesn't just mean purpose in their individual selves. We do have that, certainly, but we are also oriented toward finding broader purpose in history. We look to patterns in history. We look for progress in history because we need to be part of something bigger than ourselves, and we want to see that things are reaching towards some kind of a goal. This is just how we're oriented as creatures. So if you don't do this in terms of Christianity or any other religious context, you're going to create some other kind of notion of progress or eschatology. What is the goal? What are we aiming toward? Now, in an era where Hegel's idealism becomes popular, philosophers start thinking a lot about historical progress. They start thinking about truth in terms of process, and things are essentially getting better. And Hegel's an idealist, which means that he sees this more in the realm of ideas. He talks about this world spirit that's growing and increasing, and we're thinking of, as opposed to the classical philosophers, if you look at someone like Plato, when you're talking about truth, you're speaking largely about the realm of ideas, and these are kind of static ideas. They stay the same. So a classical doctrine of God, for example, will say that God's being is unchanging. It's immutable. So in a context of divine immutability, that which is greatest is that which is unchangeable. With Hegel, he still sees truth really as the realm of ideas. That is the ultimate reality. But we are growing toward truth. Right? We are increasing. So we're not looking at something that is just statically always true. We are looking at the process of becoming rather than the process of being. Now, this debate between being and becoming is something that goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers. But we're looking at becoming rather than being as the source of truth. So you have this notion of progress throughout history. Now, Hegel's largely talking about progress of ideas. So he's not a communist. This comes later. He's talking about the history of ideas, and Hegel largely even sees himself kind of as the height of all progress of philosophy. He's like the final great philosopher in his view. Which tells you a bit about his personality and how he thought about himself. But with Marx, what you get is a materialist form of Hegel's philosophy, meaning that he grabs onto Hegel's notion of becoming and progress, but he doesn't believe in the immaterial. He believes in just the material physical world. Now, if that's the case, where does progress come from? Where is this growth? It's not in the realm of ideas, but it's here concretely in human societies. So you get this utopian kind of vision, this notion that we can equalize all people's social status. We can destroy that ruling class that is oppressing people. That's really the problem with the world. And we can get rid of private property. And once we do that, now we can create this vision of people they're all provided for. Everybody has, the same amount of wealth. We share. We don't hoard wealth for ourselves as the bourgeoisie does. And, it's a nice vision, theoretically. It doesn't work in practicality because every time that Marxism has been tried, it doesn't work. Because, well, how do you make everybody equal? Now, historically, and this is Leninism, is a term to speak about the imposition of Marxism in a political sphere. So Marxism is really just this kind of theoretical idea. Leninism is, how do we put this actually in practice? Well, the way that you make everyone equal is by putting someone into power that can now force everyone to be equal. And what have you done? All you've done is now you've taken oppression from the bourgeoisie, and I'm not saying that that's not real, because it is. There absolutely is oppression from the rich to the poor. That's just an obvious fact of history, and of just like open your eyes and look around at any community you live in. It's obvious. But now you've changed the bourgeoisie so that now you have a new bourgeoisie, which is you have someone supposedly from the proletariat taking over and starting a political revolution, and now they're coming to power, and now they're exerting their power to make sure everyone is equal. Clearly, you haven't actually solved the problem, because now you have just replaced one bourgeoisie for a different bourgeoisie, one that is revolutionary and not tied at all to history, and the conditions tend to get worse every single time that it has actually occurred in history. And, I know, there's the saying that real communism has never really been tried, and we still have to try it because it wasn't real communism. Now, I had someone challenge me on that. And say, no, Marxists really say that real communism hasn't been tried. And I don't know. I've heard it from Marxists multiple times. So, I don't know who I'm talking to, but apparently people that still use that kind of language. So what happens then is you have this new oppressive ruling class, but the new oppressive ruling class claims that they are working for the good of the oppressed class or the workers. But they're really just abusing the workers even more than they were being abused in the first place. Now, in this book, Dreher uses Alexander Solzhenitsyn as his kind of exemplary figure. That's his jumping off point for this entire discussion. Now, as we're talking about the issues of Marxism and then discussing how that actually relates to where our society is today, there's a quote of Solzhenitsyn's which I think is very powerful and very applicable. Now, it's one that you've probably all, maybe many of you have heard at various points, but I think it's extremely helpful. And I'm reading it so I don't get it wrong. He says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through the states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts." And I think that really is kind of the key. That's the key to this entire discussion from a Christian perspective, is where do we find evil? Is there a class or group of people that we can classify as those are the evil people? And as long as we fix things with class X, society will be better. And that really is at the root of the issues of communism, because communism says, well, evil is to be found in the bourgeoisie. And so as soon as we replace the bourgeoisie or get these evil, oppressive people out of power, now all of a sudden we can have equality. What goes unrecognized is the fact that good and evil exist in every single human person. This is the nature of original sin. And if that's the case, getting rid of one class of people doesn't actually deal with the problem, because the problem goes far beyond social classes and social groups. And this is something that I see in the church as well. So we can certainly blame the far left for this, and I think rightly so. But I tell this to pastors in seminary classes. I've said this multiple times. Is if you want a sermon that your congregation is really going to love, the best thing you can do is preach about the sins that don't affect your congregation. Because, honestly, if you preach about the sins of the culture and say your church really doesn't deal with those particular sins, people are going to say, "Pastor, that was a great sermon. That was amazing." And you're going to feel really good about what you just preached. And they'll pat you on the back and say, "Yeah, Pastor, you go get those pagans outside the church." Well, is that really what your calling as a pastor is? No. Your calling as a pastor is to proclaim God's law and the gospel, and God's law is to be preached to those who are there in your church, because you go to church partially for the uncomfortable hearing of the law that afflicts your heart, because you are there to hear about your sin. God's law pierces the heart. It doesn't just equip you to go battle sin out there, but it deals with the issue in here. And so the role of the pastor is to proclaim God's law in such a way that maybe people come out of the service hating you because you've touched on something that's real in their hearts. And you're not going to get as much praise for it, because that's the way that people function. This is part of sin. We don't want to look in us. We want to look out there. This is part of the reason why conspiracy theories end up being so popular. And so I see the same kind of problem on the far right. And many of you know that I'm extremely critical of the far right for a lot of reasons. I tend to think that a lot of the far right leaders are really just grifters who have seen an opportunity because of the craziness of the left, where the left has gone today. And they've seen a way to kind of get a following and make a quick buck. And I think there are evidences of that being the case on the far right of things. But the far right does the same thing. The far right says we want a group of people to blame, to say they are the cause of all of the problems that we are facing. And now they can blame some vast Jewish conspiracy or whatever they want to do. Or the conspiracy theorists do this with the notion that there is this, secret Illuminati that's controlling things all around the world. We naturally orient ourselves toward finding evil that is outside of us, because we want there to be a solution to evil, and there is, but we don't want anything that points inward. We don't want to deal with that, because that means we have to deal with our own junk, and it's hard. But we want to point the finger outward. So that's the natural response. So you see the attraction, I think, in a lot of far left ideologies, and far right ideologies is the same, which is we can point the finger here and here and here and here and say, you're the problem, you're the problem, you're the problem, you're the problem, when God's law points us here to ourselves. Say, nope, we're all the problem. that's sin. So how is this then affecting our culture today? Because I've talked about Marxism, communism a little bit, and what does that mean for today? Are there, are our politicians today, or many academics today, Marxists? Well, actually, yes, a lot of them are, but maybe not blatantly so, and certainly they wouldn't claim to. Many of them don't claim to use the term, and in the past, I've used the term cultural Marxism in the past, which I know that a lot of people had used, and all of a sudden, cultural Marxism doesn't exist. And that it's the talking point today of the left. And I stopped using the term because I just don't want to have this dumb argument, but the talking points of the radical left today now is cultural Marxism actually was never an intellectual movement. It's just a boogeyman term. People made it up. It's never existed in academic circles at all. It actually is. It comes from what was labeled cultural Bolshevism, which was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory by the Nazis. And therefore, if you speak about cultural Marxism, you're a Nazi. I mean, that's the line of argumentation. My most popular video on YouTube is about cultural Marxism. So I've gotten the accusation thrown at me many times that I'm a Nazi, which is insane, but it's bizarre. It's amazing. There was a Wikipedia page, up at one time on cultural Marxism. And as soon as the left started pushing that this didn't exist, all of a sudden it disappeared. There's no evidence of cultural Marxism anymore. You can find publications in academic journals and magazines and newspapers and journalists who have all used the term cultural Marxism in the past. And it's basically just erased now because that doesn't exist. It's just a right-wing conspiracy theory, which is so odd. But what is cultural Marxism? What do we mean by that? And do people misuse the term cultural Marxism? Yeah, a lot. Do people misuse the term Marxism? Yeah, a lot. There are people on the right that accuse everything of Marxism or intersectionality or whatever thing they don't like. And I think I would critique all of these things. But I think there's an overuse sometimes of these things, which goes beyond the intended meaning. But that happens on the left like crazy. That's actually what happens to anything when you're critical, is there is academics use terms in precise ways, and then lay people on various sides of the aisle who don't know all the academic nuances just start to use that term as a kind of vague label to place on things without really understanding the historical complexities of those ideas. It happens on the left and the right. That's just how kind of academic dialogue works, is when it trickles down to the non-academics, they use terms in broader senses than I would be comfortable using it. So it's not just a problem on the right. That's just what happens. But I really just don't see how you can deny that cultural Marxism exists, which basically says this. The Marxist critique, which divides people in terms of class systems, it does it economically largely within Marxism. I mean, really, it's only economic in Marx. That basic kind of structure of thought where you divide the oppressor versus the oppressed in terms of economic classes in Marx, that's going to be highly influential upon nearly every school of thought in the 20th century. And so it certainly impacts the way that sociology is done and that people speak about sociology. Marxism impacts the way people talk about gender in all sorts of disciplines. So to say cultural Marxism is simply to say that some of the dynamics of Marxism, because they're so influential academically, I mean, across the board, that of course it's going to have an impact upon how people view culture and how people start to critique culture. And that doesn't mean that they adopt every single thing that Marx ever said, but it is clear in just academic discourse in general that we see a large shift from Marx and forward. And that shift is we start talking a lot about people in terms of what class they belong to, and dividing up one oppressive class and an oppressed class. It's just a fact of history that's done. And I don't really know how you honestly read academic sources and can somehow argue that that's not the case. Of course it's the case. It's sometimes been said that really there are three major figures that affect nearly every intellectual in the 20th century, and that's Marx, Freud, and Darwin. And I think that's absolutely right. There's no avoiding the influence of those figures, much like someone like Immanuel Kant. And so Marx is a major intellectual figure that has influence far beyond his narrow sphere of economics. So how does any of this relate to what's going on today, as Dreher is talking about? Now, I'm going to read a little bit from the text. This is on page 9, and I'm still at the very beginning, and I haven't gotten through nearly anything that I want to, really, so I may continue this. If you have any interest in me doing this. If you don't, it's fine. Okay, so he says that, he's asking the question, can we really talk about soft totalitarianism? Is that just this conservative kind of overreaction to what's going on in the academy or in the culture today? And he says this, the poet and literary critic Czesław Miłosz, exiled to the West from his native Poland and as an anti-communist dissident, wrote that Western people misunderstand the nature of communism because they think of it only in terms of might and coercion. And this is so often what happens in a lot of the rhetoric that's going on today, is that if you ever make a claim that, say you're having difficulty keeping your job because your job has a, say, requirement that you support equality in this or that way. I mean, and this is the thing that happens, by the way. I've spoken with a number of people in these kinds of situations where their jobs have they're evaluated. They have a regular job evaluation, as many jobs do, and within that yearly job evaluation, one of the things that they're evaluated on is their commitment to equality. And there are people that I have spoken with that say, if my boss finds out, if our company finds out that I hold to a traditional view of marriage, regardless of whether they even talk about it at work or it would affect in any way what they're doing in the company, they say, I would lose my job. And that's the case in a lot of places. It's certainly the case where I live, but I know that's the case in a lot of the places in the United States. And so there is a real fear and danger of ostracization and losing your income. Yeah, if you can't hold a job, I mean, that is a certain kind of pressure. But the left tends today to say that the right are just extremists who have a persecution complex, and as long as they're not, out on the streets being beheaded, then they're not really persecuted. They're just making things up, and they're just paranoid, and they're this and they're that. Now, to be honest, I think if they were on the streets being beheaded, they'd find an excuse for it too. But this is what Dreher is speaking to here. So Miłosz says this: that is wrong. There is an internal longing for harmony and happiness that lies deeper than ordinary fear or the desire to escape misery or physical destruction. And in other words, communism is not just about power from the top down, but there is this internal inherent desire for meaning and purpose and happiness that is fueled by things like Marxism. Marxism is an offer of a kind of religion, because it is a way to say, you have a part in this great story. There is an explanation for sin. There's an explanation for where the future is, what's right, what's wrong. And it poses an alternative narrative to the Christian narrative. Now I'm going to read again a quote. This is from Dreher. He says, today's left-wing totalitarianism once again appeals to an internal hunger, specifically the hunger for a just society, which is a good desire, one that vindicates and liberates the historical victims of oppression. It masquerades as kindness, demonizing dissenters and disfavored demographic groups to protect the feelings of victims in order to bring about social justice. The contemporary cult of social justice identifies members of certain social groups as victimizers, as scapegoats, and calls for their suppression as a matter of righteousness. And so this is really the problem with a lot of social justice movements. Not that there is a concern for justice or the liberation of the oppressed. Those things are part of, really, they're part of the Christian inheritance of the West. And I know that I've said that before, and people have criticized me and say that's not a unique Christian idea. It is. I would urge you to read Tom Holland if you want to get a historical take on this. But this desire for the liberation of the oppressed and for justice is a good one. In itself, it's a good one. And it's something in us inherently or internally knows is good. And so what the extremist social justice movements on the far left do today is play into what is that inherent internal knowledge and desire for justice. Because God is just, and God has created a world of justice. And so something in us that is a may call vestiges of the Imago Dei that are here. We recognize that somehow internally, but it's twisted and distorted. And so what this idea, and justice is good, right? Justice is biblical, so justice is good. We should, as God's people, care about justice. Should we care about social justice? Well, what do you mean by that? Justice certainly has social dimensions. Justice is not just a matter of individuality, though it is partially individuality. It has social dimensions. So we have to go, though, beyond just the terms themselves. And a lot of, I think, the debates today, people center on the terms. Is social justice good or is social justice bad? And I always think, let's step back and say, what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by social justice? What issue are you talking about? And let's define our terms before we just jump into debates about whether this is good or this is bad. What do you even mean by the term in the first place, and how are you using it? Because there certainly is a way to talk about social justice that is biblical, and there certainly is a way to talk about social justice that is far from it. And we're doing work on a university campus. I see the attraction of a lot of these radical social justice movements, and repeatedly, and this is why I'm talking about this issue, because I have repeatedly seen young people apostatize from the Christian faith because of these social justice movements. Because it's easy enough, right, to say, just who cares what the world does? If we're the church, we can just be the church. We're Christians. The world's always going to have its weird ideas, and we shouldn't fight back against any of it. We should just kind of accept the persecution as it comes, because God's church grows in times of persecution. I mean, that's true. And we shouldn't really worry about it much at all. Well, I mean, that sounds all well and good if I'm just thinking about, say, me. If I'm a single Christian person, I can handle opposition in the world. I've lived with opposition my whole life, being a weirdo for my faith and who I stand for. Like, that's fine. I'm fine with that. But this isn't just an issue of your individual self and whether it's good for you and you can deal with it. But it's a question of your children. It's a question of, are your children going to retain the faith? Are your children going to die and go to hell because they have been taken away by these various movements that are a replacement of Christianity? And it really is that question. It's do I want my kids to go to hell? And the fact is, if we aren't putting up a fight on these issues, what we're doing is allowing just that. You are not fighting against not just non-Christians, but I'm talking about children in Christian families who are taken by the sexual politics of the world, and that becomes the foundation for their rejecting Christ. It happens over and over and over and over and over again. I've seen it. There's so many instances of people coming into college with a very robust Christian faith, and by the time they leave college, they've been sucked in by progressivism as their new religion, and they've rejected Christ. And it happens in secular universities, but it also happens in Christian universities. I can think back to my own Christian college experience and how many people from that Christian college have now totally apostatized. And usually it's sexual issues. It is their desire to be part of this whatever gender sexual community they want to be a part of, because it gives them purpose and belonging that they seemingly haven't found in the church. And then all of a sudden they look back on their Christian upbringing or their experience at a Christian college, and all of a sudden have these horrible stories about how nobody liked them and everybody treated them terribly and the church was terrible. Of course, those of us who were there and those experiences are like, what are you talking about? I think you've just concocted this story in your head, which I think a lot of people do, but we'll leave that aside for now. So what you have is this creation of various classes now, which Marxism does, which we're seeing in our society today, of this group is oppressed, this group is oppressor. And, you can do that with more specifically divided communities in a very clear-cut way, like you have in classical Marxism. Intersectionality makes it a little more complicated than that, because you have all sorts of different kinds of identities, and you could be both an oppressed and an oppressor at the same time, or whatever. Because you say if you're, a if you're a black man, well, you're oppressed because you're black, but you're an oppressor because you're a man, right? And I've read a bunch of books from intersectional theorists, by the way. I'm not just making this stuff up. I've read Crenshaw, and yes, I know all this stuff. I've read it. I've spent time in these sources. I hated it, but I just did it. So no, I'm not just getting my talking points from TikTok videos or something. But something else that's the case is if you're critical of the radical left, you'll be accused of not understanding them no matter what. I mean, there's nobody that can possibly understand the left unless you agree with them. That's the mindset. And I've asked people, like, is there anyone that you think, for example, people that are, heavily, proponents of critical race theory. Now, I know CRT has been used in bizarre ways, and it's a term that like everybody throws out all the time, and I think probably most people have no clue what it means. But I remember talking to somebody who was a proponent of critical race theory, and asking, is there any critic, one person that you would say doesn't agree with this, that you think represents the position correctly? And they could give me one name, and that one person was a proponent of critical race theory, but was critical of a few aspects of it. In other words, no, they can't. And this is the difficulty of the discourse that we're having right now is there is no intellectual debate. It doesn't exist. Because if you even question the narrative that you are told you have to believe, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're just promoting lies and falsehoods, you're spreading fake news, you are a bigot, you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on and on and on and on, but there is no actual room for intellectual discourse. It doesn't exist. Because for the left right now, there isn't such a thing as actually understanding their position and disagreeing. Either you're on their side or you're lying and evil. And that's kind of where we've drawn the lines. And I know it's been said politically that we've really moved from a position of you're on the other side and I disagree with you to you are on the other side and therefore you are evil. And I think that's exactly where we are as a culture, is you are an enemy. You are an enemy. So I think that when Dreher speaks about this as a soft totalitarianism, I think he's exactly correct. When we do divide ourselves into classes of oppressor and oppressed, if you're considered an oppressor, then you are part of a group that is now going to be marginalized. Because the goal, and this, I do think there are connections to Derrida as well. Now, Derrida was not a political activist. I mean, Derrida was a literary critic and philosopher. Now, I think he's confused as anything, but Derrida wasn't per se a political activist. And the political activism that we have today on the far left is, I think, a weird combination of things, even contradictory ideas, I think very much so. There's kind of a weird combination of Marxism and Foucault's power dynamics and Derrida's deconstruction, which really aren't inherently connected necessarily, but they're all kind of smushed together, and there is this blob of inconsistency that becomes progressivism today. But what you have with Derrida is, Derrida is all about reverting these binary oppositions. And he does it in literature. It's like, he kind of plays with the text. Like, well, what happens if you invert man and woman in the text? And how does that shift the power dynamics in the text? Now, that's what's happening in real life. It's a desire to shift the power dynamics. So take the power away from this group and then give the power to this group instead. And now the oppressor becomes the oppressed. And this is the problem with these far left movements, is it's not really a desire. There is no real desire for a lack of oppression. It's a desire for a different group to come into power to oppress the people that are considered oppressors. I mean, it's just the desire for this reversal of the binary opposition. So now that the white men like myself can be the oppressed instead of the oppressors. A point that I thought was very interesting in the discussion with Peterson and was in Rod Dreher was the discussion of how this affects people in the corporate sphere, because they're strange bedfellows. It doesn't really make any sense the way these things have gone, because in a classical Marxist approach, the this is largely done through political power. And what Dreher's talking about with the soft totalitarianism, a lot of it's done by corporations, because we do live in a very corporation-centric society in the United States. We are affected in intellectually far more by the media that we consume than we are by views of the government. The average person, I mean, you're sitting and watching TV shows or movies or YouTube, and that's really forming your ideas about the world. Or you're going out to stores and seeing their, pride, whatever, all over the place, and going on celebrating your, month-long holy month, because you see this everywhere you go, or at the doctor's office, or everywhere you go. It's forced on you really from corporations. It's kind of a top-down, corporations to people through media. It starts with the academy, but it comes there really more than it is, I think, than it is through a kind of political power. But Peterson and Rod Dreher, as they were talking about this, were like, well, it's kind of odd, because the people who run the corporations, I mean, those are the millionaires and billionaires. Like, those are the largely white men who are the ones that, under the kind of system that they're kind of promoting in some ways, they're the ones that would be taken down. Like, they're the people that would be affected the most negatively. And why is that the case? And I've asked this over and over again, because, I've mentioned before, I'm from Massachusetts, and I know the, upper class, white, waspy culture quite well. And looking at that culture, like, those are the people who promote this radical ideology. But I mean, there's so much contradiction in so many ways. I have stories. I have stories about the racism that I've seen, which is insane, from those waspy groups, Harvard-educated types. But they posit themselves as like these liberators of the oppressed. Like, what's the motive? And I know Dreher in that conversation said the motive is, I think, guilt. Like, there is this inherent guilt of, I feel guilty because I am successful and these people aren't. And that maybe drives them to push these kinds of agendas. Oh man, but I can tell you, these people, the people like this in their personal lives, can often be far more racist than people in very conservative communities. That's just the reality, and it's really clear. But it's really more about what's on paper, what makes them look good, than anything else. That's a story for another day. Okay. So then we have the ultimate question that really all of this is leading up to is, and I know I've skimmed through a lot of things, and I'm talking kind of vague levels. I can get into more specifics. If you want me to do this kind of thing, I could certainly do it. I know some of you really like my cultural critique stuff. Some of you tell me that you hate it and want to unsubscribe because of it. Oh, well, I don't know. I can't make everybody happy. But so what do we do? What do we do in this kind of context that we are in, where there is pressure upon us as Christians, or as people with any kind of traditional sense of, say, gender and sexuality, because that's just the issue that we're facing today more than anything else. What do we do in this culture? How do we capitulate? Because we've got to survive. The church will survive. We know that. But how do we survive? How do you function if you can't keep your job? Or you're ostracized from your community? Or you're one of the 3 conservative students at a university and you're receiving death threats all the time, which happens regularly. What do you do? Solzhenitsyn has a series of, he's got six points of that he argues he posits as like ways to live not by lies, which is the name of this book. So this is his kind of final warning to the Russian people, was live not by lies. Don't live in accordance with lies. So he says this, and as Christians, we need to be aware of this. How do we live not by lies when you've got all of these pressures on you to live by lies all the time? And first, we will not say, write, affirm, or distribute anything that distorts the truth. I think that's essential. And I know this is controversial, but when we're talking about pronoun use, Live not by lies is what I would say. Is there a pronoun? What's the term? Not pronoun, generosity or whatever it is. There are debates among Christians. How do we deal with the pronoun issue? If somebody tells you to call them by a pronoun that is not their God-given sex, what do you do? Do you just kind of ignore it and just call them that because you don't want to deal with the pushback? I think that this is a place where we have to apply this principle. Don't affirm anything that distorts the truth. Now, by that, I certainly don't mean go out of your way to yell at people and call them the pronoun that they don't want to their face just to be obnoxious and fight. It's not worth that. But at the same time, be as kind as you can, but don't affirm the lie. We are to be people of truth as Christians. We cannot affirm the lie. Second, will not go to a demonstration or participate in a collective action unless he truly believes in the cause. And I think that is very important because a lot of the causes that people are standing up for today, protests, gatherings, while sometimes the things that are underneath those protests can be things that are very good, oftentimes there is an organization running the protest or ideas behind the protest that go far beyond what you think you're protesting about. So I would say look into the ideologies of the organizations that you are supporting if you are protesting. And first of all, protesting is a good thing. That you can speak your mind. It's part of American culture and society that we have the freedom to be able to do that. But be careful in protesting and make sure that the organization that is organizing the protest that you are then kind of representing when you're there isn't standing on a basis of lies, even if you may agree with certain tenets of what they're teaching and saying. Okay, third, will not take part in a meeting in which the discussion is forced and no one can speak the truth. Does this mean you can't go to classes in college? I feel like that's the case at a lot of universities. If you follow this, yeah, maybe. Okay, will not vote for a candidate or proposal he considers to be dubious or unworthy. That seems pretty obvious. Will walk out of an event as soon as he hears the speaker utter a lie, ideological drivel, or shameless propaganda. Now that's bold. And walking out is not, it will make a statement, but walking out is not the same as standing up and screaming at the speaker, as happens anytime a conservative speaks on a college campus, it seems like. But it will speak. It will speak. And you at least retain in your conscience, I am not going to stand by and listen to the lies. And you could feel good about your conscience. Whether that person continues to do what they do, you've done your part. And finally, will not support journalism that distorts or hides the underlying facts. Well, I guess that means will not support journalism. Okay, so those 6 points are good. I think a really good summary of what we have to think through today. So as we face these hostilities from our culture, we're just going to increasingly have to wrestle with these questions. There's going to be more and more pressure upon us to affirm particular ideas about sexuality and gender that I think we just can't affirm as people who believe that, well, what everyone on the planet believed until 5 years ago. But we can't submit to the lie. We are called to be gracious as Christians, and I believe we should always act in grace, but never at the expense of truth. And whatever the consequences are, we have to be ready to face them. And whether right now it just means I can no longer watch Disney Plus with my kids, or let my kids watch literally any TV show or movie that's come out in the last couple years or in the future, seemingly, because they can't do that without progressive ideology being shoved in their faces. Oh, well. Is that the worst kind of persecution, that I can't watch the Netflix show I want to watch because I don't want to abide by the lies that are there? Not really, but we see it as persecution. and that's the kind of mild stuff that we're so afraid of. But we really need to speak. And I think when you're thinking of lectures and stuff, this just makes me think, turn off the TV. Like when you're watching a show that distorts the truth so profoundly and is pushing an agenda very clearly, shut it off. Don't give it your money. And that's a point where I've come. I just don't watch TV. I just don't. I don't watch anything. I am still watching the Star Wars shows on Disney Plus right now. I know that that's coming because I've given up on other Star Wars media, because it's just all ideological drivel. But I'm sure it's coming in the TV shows. But I'll watch them until then. As soon as that shows up, I'm done with that too. And then I'll just watch reruns of old shows if I watch anything, or nothing at all. This is why I've gotten really into watching operas, because that's what I do. Old operas and stuff. So anyway, these are some hopefully helpful things to think about. These are difficult times. There's a lot that we're trying to navigate. We have to think about as a church. How do we navigate these things? How do we exist in our communities and cultures that are so opposed to truth? So, all right. Well, thanks so much for watching and or listening to this. Make sure you do subscribe on YouTube and on whatever your podcast app is that you like. I know the podcast usually comes up later than the video. So sorry, you've got to wait, podcast listeners. If I can be honest, the reason for that is because I get some monetization through YouTube and I don't through podcasts. So I kind of incentivize people to watch the YouTube videos instead of the podcast first. But these all do come to the podcast audio as well. You may have to wait a week, but it's all on there. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.